Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Dani Ryan. We are talking all about Apt Pupil today, which is the third adaptation from King's Collection, Different Seasons. The only story that has yet to be adapted is The Breathing Method, but I hear there's something in the works for that. Who knows if it'll actually happen, because right now, nothing is happening for anyone, for any film, anywhere pretty much. But Dani, how are you doing today?
I'm doing as good as possible, all things considered. Happy to be here chatting with you.
Same. This is a movie that we have a little disclaimer right at the top. We know that Bryan Singer was very much involved with this movie. We are aware of the accusations, especially the onset accusations that have been made against him. And Dani, you and I were talking a little beforehand about some of the other just weird things that happened on set that maybe were honest accidents, but there is a shower scene in this movie where only adults were supposed to be totally naked, and then there were teenagers who ended up in the shot because they were sort of just ushered in and told to get undressed, basically. And, you know, it's one of those things where because we weren't there, we don't know exactly what went on. We don't know who knows what went on, but we did want to at least address those right at the start of this episode, that we are indeed aware of them.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to put out there, we know there's some nasty stuff out there about Bryan Singer. Even more has come out since, these accusations in this movie and all that was settled out of court. But at the same time, it's dodgy, and some of the stuff he's been accused of is sort of represented in the movie a little bit because it's a homoerotic relationship between an older person and an underage person. So we just wanted to clear the air there.
Yes, and when I was creating the spreadsheet for this, I didn't know exactly who was involved with any of the movies I hadn't seen because I had not seen Apt Pupil before. Had you seen it back closer to the release date?
Yeah, so I saw it back, not right when it came out because I was a little too young, but a couple years after because I was obsessed with Joshua Jackson, who plays the best friend in it. He was Pacey on Dawson's Creek. I had posters of him on my wall, so I saw it mostly for that reason, but also because I had read the short story and had no idea how they were going to make it into a movie. So I was like, all right, how'd they do it?
Yeah, to keep on the cast real quick, too, you have a big name in Ian McKellen, and then you have Brad Renfro, who was pretty big at the time. He was definitely one of those sort of teen heartthrob kids from what I can tell, and unfortunately he has since passed away. He died at the age of 25, which is super, super young, but unfortunately not totally uncommon in Hollywood.
Yeah, very tragic, but not very surprising. I think it's interesting that McKellen plays a Nazi in this, given that, one of his biggest roles now is as Magneto in X-Men, who's a Holocaust survivor. That's just kind of an interesting dichotomy for me.
Yeah, I was like, oh, this is very interesting because this was obviously before he was really known as Magneto, because this came out in 98. So pretty much right before those X-Men movies started hitting, and he had the big role in that. But you also just have such a random cast otherwise. You have David Schwimmer as Edward French, which this is peak Friends era too, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, this is really peak Friends era. Yeah, Ross is a creeper in this.
Yeah, and you have Bruce Davison, Ann Dowd, and Elias Koteas, who are all names that I was familiar with going into this. And I didn't necessarily know they were going to be in it because, like I said, when I made the spreadsheet, I didn't necessarily know all the cast and crew details. I was just like, oh, here's another Stephen King adaptation. Let me add it to the list. And I looked up the dates, and that was sort of the extent of my research into these things before the podcast, unless I had already happened to have read some of the books, seen some of the movies and TV series, which of course I had, because I don't know how you go through life not watching at least one Stephen King thing.
Right? Everybody's seen something.
Even if you don't realize it. I know a lot of people who are like, oh, Shawshank and The Green Mile are Stephen King things.
Or Stand By Me.
Yes.
Same book as this one right there, so.
Yeah, exactly. But story-wise, Apt Pupil does stray from the source material. Part of it is probably for the best, because in the novella there is sort of this dream rape sequence that probably would not have played very well on screen.
Yeah, that's the sequence when I saw that there was a movie. I was like, how are they going to do that part? That part is one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. It is the reason I will not reread Apt Pupil. It's actually the only Stephen King story I will not reread. I'll even reread Rage. I don't care. But Apt Pupil, that sequence is just, it's evil.
I will tell you, I will never be rereading the Tommyknockers, though.
Well, it's really long.
Yes, also that, but that is not why.
Fair. I haven't read that one, so I don't know.
Okay. Well, now you know my thoughts on it, generally speaking.
Excellent. I'll skip that one. Apt Pupil's rough. Yeah, there's the dream rape sequences left out, and instead they just have sort of like they just more focus on the cat in the oven stuff.
Yeah.
Which is, I remember in the book, I thought they actually got the cat in the oven, but maybe I'm wrong.
I was pretty sure that was what happened too, because I was like, wait, I don't remember the cat going out the window. And this adaptation really toned down a lot of the violence.
Oh yeah, they only kill one person.
Yeah.
And in the book, they kill like dozens.
I was like, wait, doesn't the kid like become a serial killer essentially in the novella? And I was like,
well, and he's in middle school.
Yeah.
Like he's like 12 instead of 16, which is a huge difference. It definitely tones things down, which is good, you know. And I think it's an interesting story, but none of the characters are likable. You don't have anybody you're rooting for. And it's just kind of unpleasant, even removing the singer aspect. It just makes my skin crawl.
Yeah, and it was one of those ones where I went into it, I was like, okay, I know now that Bryan Singer is involved, you know, in the opening credits, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I'll like this. And I will say, ultimately, I liked it enough because I think it pulled enough from the story, but didn't have all of these aspects that were just so horrific. There are obviously horrific things that happen in here, and the novella takes place over a longer period of time. It's not just one school year for the boy. And the thing that I found interesting was largely Ian McKellen's performance as Kurt Doosander, or Arthur Denker, which is his new Americanized kind of name, even though as soon as he opens his mouth, it's very, very clear that he's not American. And then you have Brad Renfro's performance as Todd Bowden. And I just thought when those two were on screen, it worked so well. Just the back and forth between the two of them.
Oh, their chemistry on screen is incredible, both in sort of their distaste for each other. There's sort of this mutual hatred, but there's also this weird mutual respect. And I think that's something that's really interesting in the book that was kind of hard to like bring across in a movie, but they managed to do it, and the performances are what sell it, because McKellen and Renfro are both incredible. And there's moments in this where McKellen is acting purely with his face. There's no dialogue. It's just his eyes. And he's great. I mean, he's always great, but in this, it made it better. It definitely made it a lot more watchable.
Absolutely. It was one of those things where I was kind of like, okay, I know the story. It's been a while since I've read it because Different Seasons was pretty early on in King's career. I believe it was, you know, his second or third collection. And he has some that are strictly short story collections, but then there are some that have like one novella, like The Mist or something, and then the rest are shorter stories. But then with Different Seasons, it was just straight up 4 novellas, which is similar to his most recent book, If It Bleeds. So he has all of these different kinds of collections too, and I think Different Seasons is still one of my favorite ones, even if I wasn't a huge fan of the breathing method. And I know you said Apt Pupil is one you won't reread, and I don't even necessarily feel the need to reread Different Seasons, so to speak. It's just something about that collection was so human that you understand, you know, how people care about each other in The Body, which became Stand By Me, and in Shawshank. But then you have something that is just sort of pure evil with Apt Pupil that it really did feel like it was going to be hard to translate on screen. But when you have the two of them together, just the mutual blackmail aspect of it all, it's like this kid is really out for blood because he figured out who this guy is. And even though it's kind of amazing that this random high school kid figured out who this guy was when he had been living his life probably fairly peacefully without anyone else noticing.
Yeah, it's weird. He's sort of a unique character, the kid is, because he's really interested in not only in the Holocaust and all the Nazi stuff and all that, but he's really interested in cruelty. And he uses that cruelty on the very person he learns it from, on Ian McKellen's character. And I think that's something that Renfro brings to it in particular. There's this malice lurking beneath him the whole time. Like, even in the very, very beginning, when you're like, oh, maybe he's an innocent kid, he's just got this look in his eyes where you're like, oh, no, no.
Exactly. And it makes it very hard to sympathize with either of these characters because at first you are almost tempted to feel a little for Doosander because he's just living his life. He's clearly an old man who is not going around harming people anymore, but the Holocaust was such a big thing that is so unforgivable. Even if he was someone who was just taking orders or something like that, you're kind of like, man, I get where this kid is coming from, but then he just takes it so far to where you don't even feel anything really for Todd because you're like, dude, you're blackmailing this old man who's probably going to die fairly soon anyway, and you're just forcing him to teach you how to be as cruel as he was once upon a time.
Yeah, he's just a little turd. That's the only way I can kind of think of it. He's a bad kid. He's a bad seed. And I feel one of the things that doesn't work, one of the things that bothers me both in the novella and in the movie, is that they don't really explore the reasons behind that at all. We don't know why this kid is the way he is. His family seems all right. His life seems okay. So is this sort of like that nature versus nurture thing? Like he was just born bad and now he's looking to nurture that through this Nazi guy? Or what is that? And I feel like that little bit of backstory would maybe make these characters a little more easy to empathize with, like knowing why he is this way. Like, was he abused or, did something happen? Did he see something crazy that sparked something in his mind? And just a little bit of backstory, I think, would be really good.
Yeah, all they really give us is that he was learning about the Holocaust in class and supposedly saw this picture of him. And it's like, okay, what are the odds that someone's history book would have a picture of the dude who happens to be living in your town?
Yeah, that's a little coincidental. Little too coincidental, but that's okay.
Yeah, and I don't remember how exactly it unfolded in the novella, but I do know that in the novella they spent a lot more time together than we get to see on screen, simply because you can do that in a novella and make it interesting, but on screen you don't want to see this kid in this dude's kitchen for, 45 to 60 minutes.
Yeah, it's kind of like Hearts in Atlantis, the King book with it. They made into a movie with Anthony Hopkins. It's like both of these books are mostly just a kid and an old man sitting at a table talking to each other.
Yeah.
Completely different ends of the spectrum. But yeah, again, it's that sort of depth that feels like it's missing.
Yeah, I haven't read Hearts of Atlantis yet, but it's coming up in a book or two, if I'm not mistaken. So I did know that Anthony Hopkins was in the adaptation, though. And it's one of those things where when you have personalities like Ian McKellen and Anthony Hopkins in something, you're kind of wanting to watch it anyway, just because you want to see how they handle these performances that you're not totally sure of how they'll look on screen. And that's one of the things that I think I found the most compelling about Apt Pupil was just how well he was able to take this role and just run with it, because he goes all out. When Todd gets him the uniform and tells him to march, he just goes so overboard with it. You're like, yeah, I probably would too if I were him.
Well, and it's interesting with that, like the conflict when he first gets him the uniform, and you can kind of tell like he isn't sure if he wants to put it on or not. And then as he's marching, he's very hesitant at first until he gets yelled at. And no, march! And then he really starts going. And I feel like that made me the teeniest bit sympathetic with his character. And it's the only time I felt sympathetic with any of the characters in this. And also the very, very end was like my favorite part. The way that Doosander takes himself out, and just that moment is chilling and really, really cool.
Yeah, it's one of those powerful closing scenes where you're just like, oh, okay, that's where we're ending this. All right, I need a process.
Yeah, yeah. I saw, I didn't even remember how it happened. I was just like, I know he dies at the end, but like, do cops shoot him or what happens? I can't remember. And then you find out spoilers, pulls out his IV and blows into it. So he blows air bubbles into his own veins, which will kill you super dead. And it's a really interesting scene because they focus on the heartbeat monitor electrocardiogram. That's it? I don't know. But he's hooked up to that, and so they focus on that. And so his heart rate goes crazy as the oxygen enters, and then when it flatlines, they focus on his face. And it's a really chilling scene. It is pretty definitively Singer. It screams of sort of the stuff he did in like The Usual Suspects. He really just sort of has that look. He really likes focusing and doing slow pullbacks at the very, very end. And he likes those kind of reveals. And so that screamed of him a little bit, but I liked it. So,
One of the other big changes from the novella was that this took place 10 years later. So this took place during the 80s, I believe, and the original story takes place in the 70s, and like I said, over a longer period of time than just a year. So you have more build up there with the relationship between these two main characters, and I think the movie does an okay job once they're together of Todd asking questions and Kurt reluctantly answering most of them. And then you have times where he'll just go on and on and on. And then you see Todd having these nightmares and he kind of is freaked out by them. But at the same time, you're kind of getting this feeling he also enjoys them because of just how cruel he winds up being the entire movie.
yeah, he seems a lot more innocent in the novella initially. There's a lot more of a fall from goodness in the novella than there is in the movie. In the movie, he just starts evil. Like, from the jump that this kid's awful.
And like you said, we have no reasoning behind that because his parents seem perfectly fine. Every time we see them, they kind of live in this nice big suburban house. He has all of the things he could possibly want from what we do see of his room and things like that. And he's a straight A student, pretty much, from what I can tell as well. And then he gets so into this and his grades start to plummet. And then he goes along with the lie that his parents are abusive and everything when Dusander plays his grandfather and goes to meet Edward French, who is played by David Schwimmer. And that whole moment, you're just kind of like, okay, one, why is this man doing this for this boy? Because he is still pushing him to be better than he was in a lot of ways, even though by the time he does that, it's kind of pointless.
Yeah, it's way too late at that point.
Yeah, so it is a little all over the place with what kind of message it's trying to send, at least to Todd, from, Kurt's perspective. And I think it was one where the performances really did drive this movie for me.
Same. There's a couple of cool things cinematography wise and whatnot. There's little cool moments, but overall, yeah, it's the performances that sell it because the stories, it's okay. It's a neat concept, but I don't think it's really utilized that well. And you're coming for the performances. You're coming to see Ian McKellen as a reluctant, old, angry Nazi. And young Brad Redfoo is this like psycho killer in training. But beyond that, I can't recommend it.
Yeah, and to dive into some of the things that maybe people might not know about this going into it, Stephen King has what he calls dollar babies, and that's where he gives away the rights to a short story or novella. This does not apply to his longer books more often than not, but it's something that he would do to get student filmmakers and, these newer filmmakers a chance to adapt his work. And this was one of those dollar babies, but it also wasn't the first time someone tried to make this movie. This was try number 2, and Bryan Singer and company was finally able to get it going, but there were still some production struggles, if I remember correctly. And he went from, Danny, like you mentioned earlier, The Usual Suspects, which was one of his first movies, if not his first movie. And this ended up being a $15 million budget movie, which isn't that big in comparison to what he probably could have done post Usual Suspects.
Yeah, I would say most people probably expected him to come out after Usual Suspects and do another crime film or a caper or something in that same sort of realm. And instead, he went this really different direction. Like, yeah, this is a crime film technically, but it's such a different tone. It's so completely different. And I feel like it's weirdly erotic, and there's like nothing sexual in the Usual Suspects whatsoever. So like this is kind of like uncomfortably sexual in places.
Yeah, especially given how young Brad Renfro was at the time, and he was playing a high school kid, which most of the times actors will play characters younger than they actually are, but in this case he was playing some more mature roles for someone his age, and I think that was something that he ultimately ended up struggling with. And he had an addiction problem, and there were just so many things surrounding him that were not treating him as if he were an actual child.
Yeah, I mean, he was only 14 when they filmed this.
Yeah.
Like, he's a baby. I think it's interesting, too, that when I was looking this up, Ian McKellen sort of agrees with our assessment of the characters. He's like, I didn't like my character because he wasn't very deep. He was just a representative of evil.
Yeah.
And I like that. I'm like, yeah, there's not really depth there. He's just evil for evil's sake. And it's like, oh, okay, but why?
Yeah, depth to the characters would have added a lot more to this movie. But given what they gave us, I was like, okay, I'm going to sit here and I am probably going to enjoy at least Ian McKellen's performance.
Yeah, exactly. And Schwimmer's right for his role. Like, the casting's good, but it's a challenging movie. So that's kind of the hardest thing about it, is just that it is deeply challenging, both from the actual content that's in the film and from the allegations on set and who directed and later allegations against him. So, not for everyone.
That always makes it hard to want to spend a ton of time picking apart these movies, sort of scene by scene and things like that, because I know there are other Stephen King podcasts out there that tend to have episodes that go much longer than I do, but sometimes it's one of those things where I found out Singer was involved and it's like, okay, I already committed to it for the podcast. You and I had already scheduled a time to record before I even watched the movie, I think, or right around when I watched it. And I don't really want to cut things out because of one person necessarily. And it's a hard thing to sort of tiptoe around, which is why we mentioned all of the allegations at the beginning of the episode. And for me, it's one of those things where I look at it as Bryan Singer was not the only person who made this movie.
Exactly. There were a ton of other people involved. It's not a story that's directly representative of him in some way. And so, yeah, I mean, you can still watch it and you don't have to feel bad about watching it for that reason.
Yeah, and I'm really just interested in, once this is all over, or as caught up as I'm going to be, because I don't think King is going to stop writing books until, unfortunately, he literally dies, and people are still going to make adaptations, even after he's gone.
Oh, absolutely. I anticipate them to make remakes of, like, everything, so we're going to be making Stephen King stuff forever.
It's one of those things where I'm like, okay, I know that eventually there will be more episodes of this, but right now I'm about halfway through. So I'm like, okay, how am I feeling about these things as a whole? There were so many adaptations in the 90s. A lot of them not great.
No, yeah, that's kind of the rough years, is the 90s for King adaptations. So I do not envy you right now.
Well, I did notice that coming up in the early and mid 2000s, there are a lot of TV series and TV movies. And I was like, oh God.
Yep. Prepare yourself, because some of them are really, really bad.
Yeah, I'm kind of prepared, I think. I don't know, but I think you and I have said all we really have to say on this. So last thing, ratings. I think you and I might be a little off on this, because I think I like the novella in general a little more than you do, and probably this too as a result.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think some of my distaste for the novella definitely translates to this. And then just my hesitance to let myself like certain parts of it too.
Yeah, I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5, if I'm not mistaken, on Letterboxd. I imagine you're probably somewhere closer to the 2-ish range.
Yeah, I was going to say about a 2.5.
Okay, so we're not super far off, and I think we're both in agreement, obviously, that performances are what made this more enjoyable for us for a movie that is otherwise not an enjoyable subject.
Exactly. Yeah, you got 1 star for Ian McKellen, 1 star for Brad Renfro, and then a half a star for Joshua Jackson's unibrow.
Yes, and I will say one last thing before we go. Archie is probably the most sympathetic character in this, and he's the only one who dies.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of a brutal downer of a movie.
Yeah. Well, Dani, I think that wraps this up. Thank you so much for coming on to have a relatively quick discussion about Apt Pupil today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show for $2 a month. I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.